And do you know how many people we have today?
So we had, I think, 23 registered, and we have 21 in the room, including you and me. So
Good, great.
yeah, so almost everybody's here. So if you're ready.
Yeah, just let me know when you're ready.
So it looks like everybody has joined us at this time.
Okay, good. It's asking me, okay, here we go. Okay, so I guess we're ready to go, right, Michelle?
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready. Yeah, hello everyone. Again, I'm Jay Cantrell. I'm really honored that Valerie Wood invited me to teach these classes. I did re-record the class from last week, so it's a little bit clearer and there's some more information in it. Today we're going to be talking about classical terminology, mostly the classical orders. And I think I'll go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see everything. Hold on just a moment. Can everybody see the first page that says class terminology of classical orders? And
No.
you can't? Okay, hold on a minute. Okay, I'm still trying to get things cleared up.
If there's a way to enlarge those images, they are extremely small.
Can you see the images right now?
You can see them, they're extremely small.
Oh, okay. Are they not? They're not full screen?
No.
They're in edit mode right now, not in presenter mode.
Okay, we'll do that.
Okay, so what about now?
We're hoping to have the deck done like within 3 weeks or so.
I think we're overhearing someone's conversation.
We're kind of gonna have to.
Okay, can everybody see the PDF file now?
It's still in edit mode and not in a full screen
Okay.
slideshow.
Okay, what about now?
Still in the edit mode.
Okay.
So Jay, we see the PowerPoint the way that you do with the slides on the right-hand side of your screen, and then like the main slide, but it's not the slides being full screen. Like you're not in presentation mode on the PowerPoint unless you wanted to stay in the edit mode so you can easily find slides. That's up to you. But it's hard to see some of the images. They're small because they're smaller on your screen as well.
I see. So edit mode, I need to get to that.
Yeah, I think if you go to slideshow, you can then like start presentation or somewhere, or there's a way to, I can't remember exactly.
You should be able to
knows.
press F5
That button there.
too.
There we go.
Oh, is this one better?
Yep, thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, great. We're still trying to get everything clear and organized. So you can see terminology of classical orders at the proper size, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so again, this class is really going to be talking about the classical orders, the terminologies. There's a lot of information. The photographs are a little bit more pleasing to look at than just the diagrams, but I'm just going to kind of quickly show you kind of what we're going to be talking about. We're just going to be discussing, again, just the basic terminology of the classical orders. And again, I'm going to go back and look at these more clearly. there's some diagrams, there's some terms, there's some dimensions, there's some ideology. So let's start with this one. I think for the most part, I think people are still a little bit on the fence about where these classical orders really originated from. There's really three basic orders that the ancient Greeks established. And I'm sure you've probably seen this before. I'm just trying to clarify some information. It's really the three Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And then, so then later the Romans add on the left the Tuscan order, which is the simplest order. And then in the Renaissance, they added the composite order. So there's really 5 classical orders that are established: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and then composite. So really the 3 existed during Greek structure and society. It wasn't until the Renaissance that they added composite and then the Tuscan order during the Romans. Then of course later I'll be talking about the proper heights of things. We kind of mentioned these last week in our classes, that the height of the column is really based on the number of dimensions to determine the height of things. I think by now you've probably seen hundreds of charts and diagrams about how the columns are actually drawn, the different nomenclature things, the different types. There's a big difference between Greek orders and Roman orders. We'll talk about that more specifically. They're going to be discussing how these things are properly designed and proportioned. There's some very basic fundamental information that each one of these classical orders has. And I think some of you guys are probably writing notes in your sketchbook, right? That you'll probably show your students. There is some information. Again, this is kind of just an hour overview of some of the information. I taught a drawing class how we properly drew and proportioned these things. Again, more specifically later, I'll talk about how every little part of this is really proportion dimension on the diameter of the columns. And let me know if I'm going too fast. Again, I'm just showing you what we're going to talk about briefly, and then we'll get into some more specifics. So again, how to properly draw and measure these details. Okay, so I want to go up and start with this. I mentioned earlier that there's really 3 basic ones. Then there's really 5 main ones. Tuscan was added, and then composite was added during the Renaissance. You could definitely tell this chart shows, I mentioned this in my class earlier, a few days ago or last week, is that if you look at the chart, is like the proportion of things is really based on the number of diameters, the height of the columns. Like for example, the Tuscan order has 7 diameters that determine the height of things. The Doric column is much taller, it has 8 diameters. The Ionic column has 9 diameters. The Corinthian capital column has 10 diameters. And of course, the composite one does. You can tell that gradually they get larger and larger based on from Tuscan all the way to composites. And of course, each has their own specific entablature, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll talk about this chart a little bit later, but there is a difference between Greek orders and Roman orders. They're similar, but very different. What I'd like to do is I just want to identify, these are the 3 basic essential parts for each columnar order. And you can write these in your sketchbook. I'll give you some time to put notes. For the most part, there is really the columnar element, the shaft of the column. Then there's the capital. Then the top of the building is the entablature. You can see on the left, the entablature. And don't worry about the numbers just yet. So there's really 3 parts to the entablature: the architrave, the frieze, and of course the cornice. And you can tell me if I'm going too fast. And by this, the numbers are corresponding to, if you look at it, it says cornice 3/4 of the diameter. That means it's the number of diameters determines the height of things. In other words, let's just take the diameter of the column here. And in other words, if you look at number 7, it's roughly a certain numbering system based on the dimensions of the column. So the base of the column is 1 diameter wide. The top of this is, depending on the order, ranging from 7 to 10 diameters tall. So it's a very specific ratio how they properly proportion the height of things. So if you look at architrave, which of course is the bottom member, the frieze is the transition plane from the architrave to the cornice. Those are both half of the diameters. In other words, The height of the frieze is half of the diameter. If you go down to the base, you can measure the height based on different dimensions for the diameter. It's really interesting to think that every little part of this is dimensioned or calculated based on the width of the diameter of the column. So there's nothing really arbitrarily created or designed in this field. And then you can let me know if it's time to switch to the next slide. Because I'm assuming that a lot of you guys are drawing these in your sketchbook or notebook, right?
What is the 5 parts to the left? On the far left, it's divided into 5 parts. What is that?
Yeah, what happened is there's really, the 5 parts are, there's a number of diameters to determine the height of the column. And then, excuse me, it's just subdivided to properly proportion the height of the column. Like if you look at where it says column is 7 diameters tall, that's the Tuscan order, which is 7. Then I think the 5 parts is really to determine where the tapering of the column occurs. Like in other words, if you look at, well, I'm not sure what the 5 parts are, but if you look at the column that says 7 diameters tall, it's divided into 7 diameters. Then I think the entire cornice from the base to the top of that is in 5 different parts, if I'm reading that right.
Yeah, if I can, I think that that one part for the entablature is the proportion of that to
Right.
the column, and you would do a similar proportion if this were to have a like a pedestal below it.
Yes, right. But this is just the proportion without the pedestal. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I guess to answer your question, I'm not quite sure why there's 5 parts mentioned because it doesn't correspond to anything on the right. But for this, yeah, go ahead.
It's typically the entablature is one fit, or the column is 4 parts and the entablature is 1 part.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's pretty much the same for all the orders.
Yes, but this is really showing you how all the parts are proportioned, determined based on the diameter of the column. Okay, so are we ready to go to the next image? I can give you some time to draw these in your sketchbook. Yeah, are we ready to go to the next image?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so this is in more specific terms. Can you guys still see that?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so really, again, everything is what I mentioned earlier is that, you know, there's a very careful way to design the sizes of these things. Of course, in our classical moldings class, we talked about pretty much all the moldings are really determined by the width of the column. The little numbers on the left show every little dimension is based on a certain dimension for the column. Like in other words, you know, by the time the base is a full base, by the time it reaches the capital, the tapering diminishes the width of the column to where it's roughly about 5/6 of the diameter of the entire column. So if you look at where it says the bed mold, which is the transition between the cornice and the frieze, the tinea is the little piece, the square piece. If you look at that, it's like each little increment is based on the diameter of the column. It's really interesting to see that that's how they determine the height and dimension of every little part of this. So really, if you look at where it says frieze on the left here, it says the frieze is half of the diameter. The height is determined by the half of the diameter of the base. So really, the frieze and architrave are 2 exact equal parts. Then the cornice is much larger than that. So you can write these in your note, but there's a specific term for each one of these parts. On the right, there's a term, you know, the curved mold at the top, and then of course the corona. Then of course the flat plane, the bed mold is the mold between the cornice and the frieze. So you can write those in your sketchbook. So pretty much everything the ancient Greeks designed was very specifically done by the dimension of the diameter. So nothing was really arbitrarily determined. Because I think a lot of people look at classical proportions and just think that it was just done by observation, but there's a very specific geometry and numbering system to create these proportions. So if you think about this, where it says the architrave, it's really the lintel or the beam that spans between one column to another. The frieze normally has carvings on it. Normally, it's called a zoophorus, which means a prefix has animals, or normally animal sacrifices carved into the frieze. These are just the columnar orders in its very basic parts. Each columnar order has exactly this nomenclature. If you look at some of the circles, they're mixing just pure geometry to determine the dimension and the profile of the base of the column.
So we have a question from Lorraine asking, are the diameters the same no matter what the materials are?
That's a good question. Yes, they are. Either wood, stone, or marble. We'll get into that in a little bit. Just a minute. You know, when we talk about moldings, most of the moldings here really serve a functional purpose, not just decorative. The molding actually articulates the difference between the column capital and the actual shaft. In other words, the stone carver, the wood carver would actually carve the capital itself in one piece and then the shaft in another piece. So it'd be really difficult and tedious to carve the entire column out of one piece of marble. If you look at the columns on the Pantheon in Rome, then they're actually carved out of one piece. We just have to be very careful about subtracting all the material just to make these parts. But to make it easier for the craftsman is that if you call it what's called the astragal, the molding between the capital and the shaft is an integral part of that piece because it covers up the mortar joint in the stone and the marble. You can see that these are they're properly proportioned based on using the 45-degree diagonal to determine the height of things. Of course, how far the abacus projects out above the capital. Also, there's one thing to keep in mind in every single order. This element, the frieze and the architrave, is always exactly aligned with the neck of the column, always. I'm going to show you later in the class the mistakes of people making when they don't understand that visual relationship. It looks terrible.
We have another question asking, is there an illustration where the orders are shown at the same height to show the difference in widths instead of heights?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think I have. You're saying just the width between the columns.
The questions from the person who asked the question, can they maybe chime in and clarify what they are asking?
Okay, sure. Yes. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
I'm not.
Okay.
They're not chiming in.
I think that's what the question wasn't from me, but I think it means if all the orders, if you had showed all the orders the same height,
Yes.
the columns have different widths, and so it would show the different widths of the columns as opposed to just the orders getting bigger.
Yeah, I'll go back to that image. I know what you're talking about. Are we ready to shift to a different image, or is everyone okay? Okay, let me just go back to that image. I think I know what you're talking about. You're talking about this chart. This really shows the height. You're talking about the widths.
If you would break down each order the way in which you just showed in that previous chart that showed all the diameters,
Okay.
Now, how would the widths correlate to each other? Would they get a little bit wider with each order because each order, they increase in size as we
Right.
go? Or would you see a very similar proportion between them all if they were all next to each other in that kind of like truncated molding chart?
That's a good question. I think the diameter of the column is relatively the same, meaning I think that, of course, the columns are not going to get wider based on if they're taller. That is a good question. And I'm not really sure how to answer that. If you look at this chart, we'll look at another chart in a minute, but it looks like the columns are relatively the same dimension, and they just get taller and slender by changing the different orders. Does that kind of answer your question?
I think the question is that if you were to draw all the orders at the same height,
Right.
what would the comparison be? And I think what she's asking, or the answer would be that the Tuscan is a lot thicker and
Right.
bulkier, and the composite or Corinthian
Yes.
are a lot more slender.
That's a good. I think if they're drawn at the same height, then of course you would show different widths of the columns. Yes, but again, they all have the height really affects. It does. I guess the height in this case doesn't really affect the width. But you're saying if you were to draw them all the same height, then of course the diameters would change. Yes, but I don't have a chart showing that dynamic. Yeah, I think that answers your question, right? Let me show you something real quick in this chart. This is just, I was going to show you this a little bit later, but I think I was going to show you is the comparison between Greek columns and Roman orders or columns is that the thicknesses of the diameters do change, primarily because let's look at the Greek Doric column on the far left, and you can see my cursor. And I'm going to show you some very early primitive classical temples. Again, this is, Greek Doric probably 600 BC. They really didn't have the engineering skills to maximize the structural integrity and minimize the material. So they deliberately over-designed this column for structural integrity to make sure that the building was not going to collapse. But later, when they started perfecting the other orders, further like Roman Doric and then Greek Ionic, is that the column becomes slender because by now they were able to maximize the structural integrity and not have to use quite as much stone because by this time the engineering was more sophisticated. So that's a case where definitely the columns would change the dimension just by virtue of the primitive nature of the structure. Does that kind of make sense? It's interesting to kind of see this. What I was going to say a little bit later is that, really the difference between the Greek and the Roman orders is because, the Roman architecture, they're using arches. The Greeks used post and lintel. They weren't using arches to build with. So by this time, the Roman buildings were much larger. The Roman culture was getting larger. The buildings were bigger. So the orders were much larger than, of course, the Greek orders. And of course, Greek columns are structural. Roman columns, for the most part, were decorative, which I'll get into in a couple of slides later. But does that kind of answer your questions? Yeah, hopefully it does. I mean, there's a lot of information to cover. This is some very good questions. I'm not sure I answered that accurately.
You did. He said his microphone's not working, but yes, that is exactly what he was asking. So thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's kind of go back, as I'll go back to this chart in a minute. So I think everyone understands that pretty much each order has these same parts, the column shaft and the 3 parts for the for the entire entablature. Of course, this is a more careful drawing using the dimensions of the column to determine pretty much every little piece or part. The same thing with this one. When I taught the drawing class, we actually spent an entire day properly drawing each one of these. This is actually the Tuscan order, which is the simplest order. If we were actually to carefully draw each one of the orders, it would take probably weeks for us to, because we actually use a system of 45-degree diagonals to determine how to properly size the top of the capital, the curved part, and of course the other moldings underneath that. This is a more detailed, this is the Doric order, which of course has the more explicit parts in the frieze. This is a very common classical entablature order detail because, of course, it shows the triglyphs are the part in here that is centered at each one of the columns. The metope is a non-structural member, which means it's actually the space in between the original wooden beams and the early Etruscan temples, which we'll look at in a minute. So there's some terms you need to know, is that the frieze comprises the metope and, of course, the triglyphs. Now, the triglyphs were really originally the ends of wooden beams in the Etruscan temple. So now they're using stone and marble to abstract the ends of each one of the 3 pieces of wood that would actually comprise the beam. And a lot of these parts, they look decorative. They're very carefully, specifically designed in place, because if you look at this, the tinea, which is actually technically the astragal, which separates the gap between the frieze and the architrave, these are the bottom of little nail heads, because this actually nails the wooden boards into the base of what's called the architrave here. So those are not just diagonals to look pretty. Those are actually used to be in wooden temples, the nail heads at the bottom to connect the beam to the front part of what I'm calling the architrave or the lintel. Of course, the lintel, header, and architrave is really interchangeable because those are the structural horizontal beams between each one of the columns. And I'll give you a few seconds to either sketch that or digest that. And again, we're still proportioning everything carefully done with the diameter of the column. The numbers respond to the numbers of how many diameters the column has. Then they'll divide them into different segments. If you look at this, the 45-degree or the square proportion is a very important graphic dynamic to draw and properly proportion these things. The metope normally, especially in the Greek Parthenon, has, of course, animals carved in the frieze. And normally they're celebrating battles or they're exhibiting animal sacrifices in the frieze. Let me know if I'm going too fast. Is everyone's kind of on board with things?
We have another question that
Okay.
asks, what was the original function of the, I'm going to say this wrong, mutal? I don't know how to say that.
The mutal. I think it's
Yes.
these, right? No, I'm sorry. Oh, this one. If you look
Yes,
at
that one.
the mutal, I think those are actually, well, really, they're technically, it's really strange to have a cantilever in classical architecture, but I think these are brackets to support the projected cornice, because look how far that cornice, it's actually one entire diameter away from the edge of the structure. So these technically would have been brackets to hold up the cornice at the top. That's a good question.
There was also a fun fact that was added saying that in art, figure proportions are based on head heights. Average height is 7.5 heads high. Ideal figure is 8 heads high, and heroic is 9 heads high. And then Carolyn added, makes me wonder if the classical orders of columns and figurative art are related. So,
Yes, I'm sure they are. There's also some very anthropomorphic relationships, which I don't have images of. But when you say head height, you mean human head heights? Because these are temples built for gods, not really the scale of people.
Yeah, she was talking about figurative art being a human head height in proportion. So, yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer for that. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I can look that up and get back to you, but. Okay, let's move on to this slide. This, is everyone ready? You can let me know if I need to go back or something. Okay, so this image is showing the very primitive sort of temple front. I'm sorry, the temple construction. It's showing a wood construction on the roof. Everything above the column capital is showing the wooden structure. Really, the early Tuscan temples had stone columns and a wooden structure. By the time we're doing Greek temples and Roman temples, we're looking at stone and marble. It's interesting to look at the way that they sort of interpreted the wooden construction using stone and marble. Let's take a look at what looks like letter F on the beams. These are the structural wooden beams in the Etruscan temples. Then, of course, the Greeks and Romans abstracted that into stone and marble topology. You can see that these are the sort of stylized ends of the wooden beams for the structure. If you look at this, these are really the two lintels or beams that span from one column to another. This is an interesting visible relationship because the column has a transition piece between the beam and the column. There's a square plate that the column dies onto, and then there's a huge molding that transitions from the capital top or the abacus to the shaft. And then later when we get into Ionic, Corinthian, and composite orders, the transition transition mold becomes very elaborate. They're using volutes, they're using acanthus leads. This is very primitive, a very simple sort of early wooden structure that, of course, on the right is shown as stone and marble. It's interesting to show the way that the moldings in this case on left are really not decorative. This is an integral part. What I was showing you earlier is that the nail heads, these actually nail these flanges between the architrave and the frieze, and of course the triglyphs. So when you look at the Acropolis or Roman temples, they're stylized in stone and marble. Here's another, there's a more elaborate detail about the way the early temples were kind of derived from. Of course, the stylistic, they look like, stylistic details, but they're really very meaningful because they're showing you these are the ends of what used to be the wooden beams. What's interesting is, when you compare Greek architecture and Roman architecture, that, of course, the span of Roman architecture is much wider because behind that you're using a system of masonry arches. So the spans in Greek architecture, in other words, the lintel of the architrave is relatively short because they weren't able to span that far because the structural capabilities didn't allow them to make the architrave really long and elongated. So this is a similar chart to what we looked like before, but this is actually including a base. So the classical language is just, a lot of the temples have a classical base. Of course, each part of the base is still based on the diameter of the columns. Okay, are we kind of ready to move on? These are some photographs of some of the early temples. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. Now, this is an ancient temple way before I think this is roughly the temple at Paestum. This is probably 600 to 700 BC. What I was telling you about the structures, we clearly can see all the basic parts. We see, I'm sorry, we see the column. Hold on, let's make sure your microphones are turned off. So we can see the basic parts we looked at earlier, the column, the length of the column with the shaft, the capital, then the entire entablature, the architrave, the frieze, and of course the cornice. What this is showing you is that this is, before the ancient Greeks perfected the ratio of the stone versus the structure versus the material. In other words, this is a very heavy set, over-designed column. Because later, when we get to the Acropolis, the columns don't really need to be structurally that fat because they were able to perfect their engineering to maximize the structure and minimize the thickness of the material. This is a very aggressive, sort of beefy architecture because this is a very primitive order. Again, this is Doric because this is Greek Doric because the Greek Doric is fluted. If you look at the Tuscan columns, they would be smooth because we're using stone columns and a wooden roof. So it's just interesting that there's one little piece that is still hanging out there. And so what you can see is the stylistic tend to carve in stone what used to be the wooden Etruscan temple details on this. So, okay, by now, 500 BC roughly, we have the Acropolis, the Parthenon. Look how carefully more designed. The columns are, they're much thinner. We have a careful relationship of the frieze with the architrave. Again, all these parts are dimensioned in proportion with the diameter of the columns. Again, this is the Greek Doric order. I hope I'm not going too fast, but this is a reconstruction of what the temples really used to look like. As an individual, I always find it strange that, these are really all carved out of marble, but I just find it strange that they painted marble, but I'm assuming this is a speculative reconstruction. It's really hard to see if that actually existed polychrome like this.
We do have a question asking, are the corner columns larger than the interior ones?
Excellent question. I think it's visibly hard to tell. I think, especially this one, in this example, they're all the same size because they weren't using what's called optical refinement. So I think to answer your question, yes, the end columns are marginally larger than, of course, the interior columns. And it's really hard to see this because actually what's happening is the center of architecture is very important and sacred. So the width here is actually a little bit larger than the other spacing of the columns. It's really hard. There's tons of research on they actually accommodated the curvature of the earth in some of the dimensions, which visibly by your eye, you can't really tell that, but I think a lot of that was actually considered. It's really amazing to think that they thought about that before they had even laser transits or, pneumatic tools to do that with. Again, this is just kind of the ruin of parts of the Acropolis. You can see, the nice thing about the ruins, you can see the true nature of the construction. These are the structural beams that span, of course, what's called the architraves. Originally in the Etruscan temples, this would have been wood. Do you guys have any questions so far before we talk about this one? Okay, well, so again, this chart is showing you the difference between comparative, of course, Greek and Roman orders. If you look at these carefully, the diagrams are showing the columns as a plan looking up at the capitals. So let's take a look at Greek Ionic columns and plan versus Roman Ionic. The Greeks really weren't able to figure out how to resolve the corner of the column. So really the volutes are flat on the facade and the face. But then the Roman Ionic, they're using diagonals to transfer the corner of course, the Ionic capitals, because really Greek capitals would have been flat. Roman Ionic capitals would have had the diagonals at the corner. But you can see that the Romans added a lot more moldings and detail than, of course, the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Romans actually borrowed the Greek typology, kind of perfected them, made the columns thinner and even more decorative. Okay, so let's, transfer between, Greek architecture and into Roman architecture. Greek columns and the classical orders were structural. The columns were structural. Now in Roman architecture, we don't need a post and lintel. And by post and lintel, I mean the posts are the columns, the lintels are the orthogonal structural organization. By now in Rome, they're actually building with aqueducts, the first sort of arches what we've seen in construction. You wouldn't see an arch construction in Rome. Of course, by now they're using concrete and masonry. You can span as far as you want using masonry and concrete. Let's go back up to this relationship. The main difference really between Greek columnar orders and Roman orders is that the fact that the columns in Roman architecture, this is of course the Colosseum, 1st century AD, these are all decorative. The columns here are really not structural. They do add a sort of a certain amount of buttress, lateral structural, but they're really not structural, they're decorative. And we see all the column orders in one horizontal plane: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Doric at the base, Ionic, and Corinthian. And I think they have a more elaborate Corinthian order at the very top, where these used to be spanned with canvas. It's wonderful to see the Romans using the Greek language of columnar orders with the Roman structural typology. There's really no way you'd be able to build this building in ancient Greece, especially they didn't have concrete. And you'd have to have millions of columns to span a entablature or an architrave that large, that wide. So again, here's the nuts and bolts. Of course, this was partially destroyed by an earthquake, but you can see the original facade with all the orders versus the interior facade, which you don't see any classical orders on. Of course, because this used to be completely surrounded with the classical order. This is only visible due to pillage and probably the damage of the earthquakes. It's interesting, there's a mixture of masonry bricks and, of course, the stone or marble columns that are actually the capitals.
We have a question asking, where does the Tuscan column development fall along the timeline?
That's a good question. Let's go back up to here. Okay, let's go back to here. So really, these are three, Grecian orders. This is probably, I want to say 600 AD. The Roman Etruscan order is probably 900 AD. I don't have an image of the early Etruscan temple, but this was probably 100 years before Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. But the Romans actually introduced the Tuscan order much earlier than that. A lot of people think that there's really three that the Greeks originated in. But of course, during archaeological digs and historical information, they were able to figure out that the Tuscan was really the original order by the Romans. Then the Greeks developed Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. Of course, the Renaissance, particularly with Palladio and Scamozzi, introduced the composite order. I hope, does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, this is the earliest column type, the simplest one. So we're looking at roughly 900 AD here of the Tuscan column, the Tuscan order. And we're looking at probably 500 to 600 BC between Doric and Corinthian, and 1400 for the composite order. There's a lot of time, and they're still using the column diameter to determine the proportion of everything. It's really amazing that they still use that.
Thank you.
Sure. I kind of lost my place. Let's go back to this. Okay, so we looked at the Colosseum. Of course, with the classical orders are not really structural, they're decorative. Here's a reconstruction. This used to be covered with canvas. We talked about the aqueduct. It's interesting that the Romans, you would never, normally you would expect to see the classical orders, the Greek from the Greek, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. But of course, these are really not meant to be seen and appreciated as a piece of architecture. These are simply just the structures. You would never see the classical orders on, this is for the most part, a large drain pipe, but you would definitely see them on public buildings. It's interesting to see, you can see the orthogonal Greek structure behind the classical and behind the Colosseum, and of course they're round, and then of course the arches in the Roman architecture. There's a couple of things. We have about 15 more minutes. I don't mind going over 1 o'clock. It's about 12:45. If you look at classical architecture in the Renaissance, of course, they're using Greek and the Roman classical orders. We're still seeing the architrave, the frieze, the cornice, the sanctum at the top. But look at this carefully. The columnar orders are stacked and registered between the floors. This is obviously the ground floor, floral line. The wooden beams would normally be represented here, telegraphed with the triglyphs between each one of the metopes. But of course, there's a simple carving in that. Okay, so again, the columns are placed in between the floors. The columns are placed in between the floor plates with the similar orders. Again, this is Palazzo, I think Strozzi or Rucellai by the Renaissance architect Alberti. This is roughly 1400 AD. This is 1st century AD. But look at this carefully. So the columns still fit in between the horizontal bands, which of course are the floors. Wow, Michelangelo, probably 1500. Look what he does with the classical order. He introduces the giant order. Look at that. The columns bypass the floors. There's actually two really extraordinary orders. The main Ionic order for the ground floor, and then the giant Corinthian capitals and columns that adorn the facade to show the height of the building. It makes the building look taller than it actually is. These are just enormous columns. This is, of course, the Capitoline Hill facade in Rome. Of course, Michelangelo carved. His work is very three-dimensional, of course, because he's trained as a sculptor. And I thought that was interesting that the giant order appears because Michelangelo started flipping things around and started making puns in classical and Renaissance architecture. But look at these facades, are absolutely extraordinary. He's using all the orders in a beautifully imaginative way. He's normally taking what normally would have been the Doric columnar orders on the second floor. Because Michelangelo inverted things and because he's becoming a Mannerist before we get to Baroque architecture. So he inverts the placement of things in a beautiful original language. It's ironic, isn't it ironic that the Ionic capitals are at the base. Normally it would be Tuscan or Doric, beautifully accentuated in very thinly carved Doric columns with a curved pediment. And of course, the giant order, the Corinthian order, is of course the main structure for the facade. Very original work. Oh, I'm sorry, that slide is horribly blurry. I just was kind of going to end some of the lecture with some other details that you really probably don't see from the beginning of the drawings. But you know, these are some images I talked about in the classical moldings. And what I'm saying is that the moldings here have a specific placement and a reason. You would never see the dental molding at the very bottom of the architrave. There's a specific place for this. You know, now a lot of builders and contractors are just putting moldings everywhere, and it's considered to be moldings all you can eat. There's a very specific place for each one of these moldings. If you watch the lecture which we recorded early this morning about the placement of different moldings, is that there's a very, very specific place and meaning for all the moldings to occur. These are just kind of some off the subject pictures, but you know, these are carved, you know, with chisels and hands before they had power tools. These are some other decorative elements that adorn the classical orders. We can see the egg and dart mold mixed with the dental molds, a proper transition mold between, of course, the cornice, the mutils, and of course, the frieze. But look at the way that the sculptors transfer between the egg and dart mold and, of course, the Ionic capitals. There's a beautiful little flower because that's always a very awkward corner unresolved between the two planes. Again, this is Michelangelo's incredibly layered, imaginative interpretation of the Ionic order. This is the wonderful Magnolia Hotel building around the corner from where I live in downtown. It has the work is extraordinary. Of course, they're borrowing the coffers from the ancient Pantheon. This is, of course, neoclassical architecture, roughly the 1920s. So you can see the classical orders, the same language we talked about, the architrave, the frieze, the cornice. So the last two images are, this is what classical, this is, I think, probably a classic, I think this might have been a John Staub house designed in Houston in the 20s, I'm not sure. But this is what happens when you properly apply and understand the proper classical orders. What I was saying earlier in the class is that the entablature of the neck is always aligned with the neck of the columns. Of course, you can see the careful proportion of the architrave, the frieze, the cornice, and the pediments. Of course, these are Greek Ionic columns. I'm sorry, capitals. If they were Roman, then you would see the diagonals, the 45-degree diagonals for the volutes. this is what happens when you, you don't understand or even care to apply the proper language. This is not even an order. This is just a complete accident in an architectural misadventure because, of course, the columns are misproportioned. There's not, it's kind of a bastardized capital. Then, of course, the architrave or whatever that thing is, that horizontal member, the beam is not aligned with the neck of the columns. The arches are arbitrarily placed. The centers don't meet up. When you look at that, you can clearly see a nice, careful understanding of the proper proportion of things based on the diameter of the columns. We have about 10 more minutes. Let me just review some things. Do you guys have any questions about the lecture, the images? We went over a lot of information. This is just a brief overview. There's a lot of these images were drawn by the members of the ICAA. Some of them are taken from the Vignola book. I'll condense this down as a PDF file, but I just think it's interesting that no matter what the columnar order is, there's still those basic parts, the 4 basic parts: the shaft, the cornice, the frieze, and the architrave. Carefully done, carefully thought out, carefully carved, based on every little increment relative to the diameter of the column. Any questions about anything so far? You know, if I were you, I would look more at Michelangelo's work. A lot of people think that he's this kind of tired Renaissance architect, but my gosh, look what he did with the classical language. He didn't just completely lose course, he interpreted it in a very brilliant way.
So we do have a question. We have some comments as well. Wonderful supporting images. I enjoyed your lecture. And then there's a question saying, is there a specific formula for spacing of the columns? And how does that transfer when you have an entry, like on the house that you showed?
Okay, very good. Yes, and I can't answer that with a verbal question. I can send you some images. That's a good question. It's not something, because I don't have, there's a chart that's called intercolumnation spacing. And there's a very specific dimension between the bays. Of course, the bays are the places but spaces in between the columns. You're talking about the house. You're talking about this one, right? Hold on. This one, right? Yeah, of course there is. I didn't have time to get into that, but yes, if you send me an email, it's jcantrelldesign@yahoo.com, then I can send you some graphic drawings on how to properly space those out.
I think the Francis Moroni lectures that are on the ICAA website, he did like history of Greek architecture and history of Rome. He has a couple slides in there about intercolumniation.
Yes.
And I took some screenshots from it. I can share it with Michelle.
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
That is helpful too.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I think it's almost 1 o'clock. Yeah, any more questions or comments? You know, this is just a very brief overview of the language of the classical terminology. We talked about a lot of terms. And then Michelle, I think Valerie and I can get together and just get kind of a closing PDF to email to the students in the class.
Yeah, I can help with that too. Just email it to both of us and one of us will get it sent out for sure.
Okay. Well, everyone, thanks for participating. You know, this is the beginning of several other classes. I'm not sure. I think I'm teaching a history class next Tuesday. We're doing these once every Tuesday, right, Michelle?
Yeah, sorry, we did, yes.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, good. Okay, well, everyone, thanks for participating. I think you learned a lot. It is a lot of information to kind of divulge in an hour, but I appreciate you attending, and I'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Yep, bye.